Hi, this is Becky Nunn with Nunn Design, guest designer at Beadaholique. In this video, I'd like to show you how you can press organics and put them on top of flat tags, and then put Nunn Design resin over the top of the flat tag and create pieces like you're seeing here. In this necklace charm example, I'm showing several different ways in which you can use this technique, slightly different. On this right here, this is the piece that we're doing in this video. It has the organic on the flat tag with the resin over it. This one has an open back bezel with the organics. This one has an open back bezel that has colorized resin in the base of it, and then the organics and the clear resin over the top. But again, this is the piece that we're going to be focusing on in this video. To start the project, you want to select some Nunn Design flat tags to work with. There's a variety of different shapes and different looks that you can choose from. You'll also want to have some dried and pressed organics and a Nunn Design resin kit. For the first step, you'll go ahead and the Nunn Design flat tags, you can choose from the variety that we have. You'll want to go ahead and use a little bit of rubbing alcohol onto the pieces to get the surface of them nice and clean. So I'm just using a toothpick and just getting a little bit of the rubbing alcohol. And then I'm going to mostly focus on this one right here. I'm just using the rubbing alcohol. The Nunn Design flat tags are cast in a lead-free pewter, and then it is plated 24 karat gold, 0.999 fine silver, and copper. I'm using a little bit of the rubbing alcohol on these pieces because after we plate them, we then oxidize them, and this oxidization can come off into the resin, so I like to have my surface area be nice and clean. Once you've cleaned your flat tag, you want to have a couple of business cards or some sort of cardstock that you can place your pieces on, because this makes it super easy to move the pieces around. Depending on the different organics that you have, let's see, I have some really tiny ones, so how about if we do another one that will look like this? Go ahead and wipe that one off. And place it onto a business card. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to decide on how you want your organics to be design-wise. While these two are drying from that alcohol, I'm going to show you, you can use a pair of tweezers like this, and you can move your organics around onto your clean flat tag and decide how you would like these pieces to be designed. As you can see, these pieces are very, very flat, and that's going to be really important because if they aren't really flat, the resin won't cover up fully the flower. I don't know if you can see, but like right down in here, it's not, there's a little teeny bit of a flower that is extruding out of the top. So sometimes when the flowers get two-dimensional, you can see it right there, it then won't be covered up with the resin. I could put another hit of resin on top of this to bring up the height even more and try to cover that up, but it's best to just start out with a really flat organic onto the surface area to start with. So design how you would like to have your organics look on your flat tags. So these two should be dried by now, so let's go ahead and move these out. And now we'll start to set up like exactly how we would like these to be. And you can be very creative with this whole process. You can add multiple pieces on here, multiple flowers, and kind of create different designs. But we're just getting an idea of like, okay, so that flower is going to come all the way down to that surface down there. And on this one, we'll use this little guy, and we'll place him right here. So before I mix my resin, which is going to be my next step, I'm first just taking a look at how my organics are going to lie onto my pieces and setting up all of my bezels or all of my flat tags prior to mixing the resin. Now we're ready to start to mix the resin. So I'm going to set these aside right over here, and then I'm going to bring on all my ingredients for mixing resin. When you open up the Nunn Design resin kit, you'll have a part A and part B. You'll also have some mixing cups, and I always work with a little bit of toothpicks, and you'll have a stir stick inside of the kit. And I always like to have a piece of plastic to work on. It just keeps my work surface very clean. And then you'll want to have some sort of timer in which you can time the amount of mixing that you're going to be needing to do. So let's just double check we have everything we need. We have our resin, we have our stir sticks, we have our little bit of toothpicks that we're going to drizzle the resin on, and we have our cup. You're going to want to mix exactly 1 tablespoon of part A. You pour that in always first, and 1 tablespoon up to the 2 tablespoon mark of part 2. And it has to be a full cup in order for the resin to activate. So you want to have a lot of pieces ready to go, because otherwise you'll have some waste with the resin. Start. Take off the lid and pour in your part A. And I'm getting it right up to that 1 tablespoon mark. And then I'm going to slightly ease up on my pour. Rotate my bottle, and that will slow the stream down. Double check where I am. I need a little bit more before I can get right to that 1 tablespoon mark. And now I have it. You want to use a wet wipe. I like to use a wet wipe to wipe away that resin that might have overflowed, and so I can keep the surface of my bottle, the pouring spout, nice and clean. Now I'm ready for the part B. So I can see that I'm exactly where I want to be at that 1 tablespoon mark. This part is really important to have exact 1-to-1 ratio. Now my part B is going in, and I'm bringing it up to the 2 tablespoon mark. Bringing it right up to that mark. As I start to get near it, I'm slowing my pour, twisting my cap, double checking I'm right where I need to be, wiping off the surface of my spout with my wet wipe, and putting the lid on. All right, so now we're done with that part, and we're ready to start mixing. So we have our toothpicks ready, and we have our stir stick. Let's bring back in our little pieces. And now we're ready to start mixing our resin. But before I do that, I'm actually going to remove these little guys from the surface of this tag. And you'll see in a bit why. I'm going to set my timer for the 2-minute mark. So I have it set at 2 minutes, and I'm going to push start and start to stir. So using your fat tongue depressor that is in the kit, you're going to want to mix your resin for the full 2 minutes, scraping the sides and blending these 2 parts together. When you first start, you'll see it's really marbled like this, and then as we continue to stir, it'll be completely activated, the 2 parts blended together, and we'll be ready. As you stir, scrape the sides of the cup, and then frequently scrape the resin off of the stir stick and back into the cup. So now we don't have any separate parts of A to B. All right, so our timer is going off, so I'm scraping my stir stick onto the side of the cup and turning my timer off. All right, so now we're ready to put our organics into the resin and then put the organics onto the piece. So you only need a small amount of this resin. After you've mixed this, you'll have a lot of little bubbles inside of the resin, And you'll see that I don't need to be concerned too much about that, because this next couple of steps, as we work with it, you'll see that there won't be a lot of bubbles that transfer in. So what I like to do with these organics is place a little bit of the resin down onto the surface of my work area. So that's why I like to use these little plastic bags. So I'm just dipping my toothpick into the resin and twirling it to pick up a little bit of resin and transporting it and putting it onto the bag over here. So once I have a little bit of resin over here, I'll then come over and pick up my organic. I'm going to do one at a time. This little guy wanted to come along. Somehow these guys are connected. And I'm going to press my organic into the resin and fully coat it. This is what helps, it prevents a lot of air bubbles from getting into the organics once I have it on the tag, by fully coating it first. So I'm tapping it and kind of just making sure that if there's any air bubbles or any chances that there could be air bubbles, like somewhere in the organic, sometimes like in a petal there might be some air down inside of this area. So just by tapping it and fully immersing it into there, I'm just pushing all of the air bubbles out. Next, I'm ready to pour a little bit of whoa, that guy broke while I was moving him around. I'm ready to pour a little bit of the organics right onto the surface of the flat tag. So again, with my toothpick, I'm just twirling and picking up a small amount of resin, and I only want to put a small amount onto the base here, and this is to help me give it a nice pool of resin to put the organic on, again, so that I don't trap any air underneath this piece. So I like to work with 2 toothpicks so I can move around my flat tag and not have it be anywhere close to my fingers. So I put a small amount of resin onto the base of this piece. Now I'm ready to pick up my organic and place it. Oop, this might be kind of tricky. Place it onto the flat tag. So once I have it in the little pool of resin, I'm just moving it around slightly and putting it into position. And I'm also making sure that I press out any air that might have gotten underneath the organics. This was a little tricky one because it was long and skinny and it kind of folded over in the process of picking it up and moving it over. So when you start out with this technique, you might want to start out with a less delicate one, or maybe one that's a little bit more solid and didn't have that elongation there. So now that I have it in place and I've pressed it a couple times to make sure that the air is out, I'm moving my resin out to the edge of the piece. And let me address how to do this top part here. So when you're coming to this area here where the circle or the hole is punched into the metal, you'll want to slowly drag the resin up to that area, as you can see that I'm doing here, and then you can bring it around like that. Now if for whatever reason you got some resin that dropped down into this piece, what you'll want to do is use your toothpicks, a clean one, and lift it up slightly from the card, and it'll break the contact of the resin and drain out, and then you just move it slightly, and then you would have your hole freed up. So let's see how we're looking here. If I wanted to have a little bit higher of a dome on my piece, I could pick up a little more resin, drizzle it onto the flat tag, and move it about. So the resin is a self-doming resin. So once you've shown it where the side edges are, it won't run off the sides. It'll just continue to dome, so it'll be higher in the center. And if you pour enough on here, you will eventually overflow. But I would start with a medium-sized dome like you're seeing here, and then you will let this cure. So it takes about, it'll be harder in like 24 hours, but it cures for up to 72 hours. But during this phase, you're going to want to babysit your piece because you might have some air bubbles start to rise to the surface, as resin often does. And if that is the case, you'll want to take this piece, and this is one of the reasons I like to also put it onto the card, is you'll lift it up, and I'm going to move this off of the camera, but I'm going to use my breath to breathe on it in a huff, you'll hear a huff sound. And the hot air from my breath will make the air inside of the resin rise to the surface and pop. If that doesn't work, you can use your toothpick to bring the air bubbles over to the side and drag them off the side. I actually don't think that's an air bubble. That is something, a little mar in the metal. But if you did have some air bubbles inside of here, you can agitate them and bring them over to the side and then continue to breathe on them. So you will need to babysit your pieces as they're curing, especially for the first 2 hours, just to double check that they're doing fine. And then at a certain point, this resin will be so thick that you won't be able to release any of those bubbles, and you'll just have to know that it's resin and sometimes there's bubbles. And after 72 hours, your pieces will look like this. If you had some overflow, you can pick them up at 12 hours, and you could use either your fingernail, and you can just pick at the resin and it'll scrape off and release off the sides. Here's an example of how I had some overflow. There's a funny story about how there's white on the base of it, but at the 12-hour mark, this resin is at its soft cure stage, and this is really easy to pick at and remove. This is fully cured on there and it's not going to come up. But if you had it at the 12-hour mark, you would just scrape at that with your fingernail, and this resin will peel off and be removed, so you can clean the backs or the sides if you had any overflow. Once your pieces are fully cured, if you do have a little bit of your organics protruding out the top, you can do two things. You can put another pour of resin over the top, or in this case right here, my organics were slightly protruding out the top. I used a piece of very fine steel wool and lightly sanded over the top of the resin to kind of give it that dull finish, which I love. Then after all of the resin pieces were finished and ready to be assembled, I added the Nunn Design jump rings onto some chain or combined it with some charms from the Nunn Design line to create these finished pieces. This is Becky Nunn with Nunn Design, shooting as a guest designer with Beadaholique. Thanks for joining us.